Thank you. I'm playing to a crowd of mathematicians or quants over on this side of the room, I think. Okay, so England used to be attached to Northern Europe, pretty wild and woolly place. There was a time when the caveman was there. There was a time when the woolly mammoth was there, saber-toothed tiger, pretty scary, wild stuff. But my story's not about that. Who's reading my script? Yeah. You ever heard of a football hooligan? So my first exposure to the football hooligan was back around 1974, 75, when they first started to come out and really inhabit the wild of the terraces of the football stadiums in England. And my dad took me to a few soccer games. The one I particularly remember was Manchester United playing Crystal Palace. Any Manchester United fans in here? Usually can find some somewhere. And this was before the British police figured out they needed to separate the two factions by some significant distance. And the Manchester United fans were breaking up the concrete that they were standing on and throwing it at the Crystal Palace fans. Now, I wasn't in that part, I was like 10 years old, but I can clearly remember people being carried past me on stretchers with like bits of brick sticking out of their body and blood spurting everywhere and so on. So it was pretty, to use the American phrase, it was pretty gross. Anyway, so that was my first exposure of the wildness of football hooligans as they first sort of manifested themselves on Britain. And as time moved on into the 80s and late 80s and early 90s, British football became much more sort of sedate, and they put seating in all the stadiums, which was a real revolution. You know, like what you're sitting on right now. And, you know, because before pretty much everybody stood up. And the seating in the stadium kind of encouraged more families to come, encouraged young kids to be there, families and so on. And so the environment became pretty pleasant. Well, I moved to America in the late 80s, and sometimes when I go back on business to the UK, I'd be like, I want to see a football match. So I think it's about 96. And all I see on TV is that football grounds seem pretty safe now and all this kind of thing. So I get there and I look in the newspaper, because this is before the internet was useful. And I look in the newspaper and I see Tuesday night, Chelsea versus Millwall, FA Cup 4th round replay. Now, just to fill in a little bit, an FA Cup is like the Super Bowl, so that all the teams in England go in for it and they play off against each other until they get to a final. This is not the final, this is merely the 4th round. But Chelsea and Millwall are kind of next to each other in England. It'd be like North Philly playing South Philly or something like that. It's a grudge match. I mean, you know, back in the day, back in the 70s, this was pretty rough fans. Anyway, so I buy a ticket. So I don't remember exactly how I bought the ticket because the internet wasn't useful yet. And I get out of the hotel, get in a taxi, and I go, Stamford Bridge, please, is the name of the Chelsea football ground. The cab driver looks over his shoulder at me and he goes, "You're taking your life into your own hands, aren't you, mate?" I go, "What?" He said, "Didn't you hear about what happened on Saturday?" I was like, "No, I was in America on Saturday." Well, when they played each other on Saturday, which was why there was a replay of the game, because in England we do things where like you play until you like get tired. The two teams are tied, but what was significant and why he said you're taking your life into your own hands is that before the game on Saturday, they had been throwing petrol bombs at each other. That would be putting gasoline in a milk bottle with a fuse and lighting it and throwing it. So I was like, shit. I said, "How close can you get me to the ground?" He said, "We'll go down the King's Road and see how we do." So we're driving down the King's Road, which goes from central London towards Stamford Bridge, and every shop window is boarded up or has the shutters pulled down. Oh, it's like 6:30 on a Tuesday night. Okay. Anyway, get to the ground, not too bad. big game, very exciting. You know, Chelsea scores first, then Millwall scores, then Chelsea scores, gets to the end of the game. It's a 2-2 tie. And by the way, what made me think of this was earlier on the TV here, one of the commentators on the soccer channel was Casey Keller, who's an American, who was Millwall's goalkeeper at the time. So this game now has to be decided, because this is the replay of the Saturday game with the petrol bombs and so on and so forth. So they have what's called a penalty shootout, if you guys have ever seen that. So it's like each team gets 5 penalties, and the other team, whoever scores the most goals, now wins. Casey Keller, it's very hard to save a penalty if you guys have ever seen this. I mean, the odds are very much in favour of the guy who's shooting at the goal. Casey Keller saves 3 of Chelsea's 5 penalties. Wow. And Millwall goes through to the next round, and the Chelsea fans go fucking mental. Pardon my French. The Chelsea fans rush onto the pitch, a bit like Chris was describing the Detroit situation. The British police are on horseback, charging them. The Chelsea fans rip the goal out of the ground. They're going completely berserk. I'm sort of like high up in the stands, so I think I'm kind of okay, but like, what happens when we leave the ground? The expression in England used to be, I'm scared shitless. I was. Anyway, I got up the King's Road, I did get home, back to the hotel. Then one of my good friends in England called me on the phone a couple of days later. He said, because this was like the first time there'd been a mounted horseback charge against a pitch invasion for like a decade. And he said, did you see that crazy shit that was on at Chelsea the other night on the news? I was like, yeah, I was there. He goes, no, you weren't. Yeah, I was. And that was my adventure into the wild of the British soccer hooligan.